Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning to everyone who joined us via Zoom meeting as well as on the YouTube stream. Thank you very much for making your time today. It is a pleasure from us, Sejahtera Center for Sustainability and Humanity IIUM, in collaboration with Management Services Division, MSD IIUM, to organize this sharing session on scenario planning for higher education. My name is Idayu. You can call me Idayu or Sister Idayu. And I would like to share with you about senior planning, which some of us have heard and some of them might have heard it for the first time. So a bit of a background about our Sejahtera Center and why it is relevant for us to talk about sustainability as well as future studies in relation to the university agenda. So as many of us also know that the university is pursuing the concept of Sejahtera, which is an indigenous concept of sustainable living. And part of it, that's one part. And the second part, we also invest in the knowledge of futures and the action of futures. If you know that recently the university has organized a workshop to formulate how would IIM 2030 looks like. And that's part and parcel of it. So scenario planning is part of future studies and is part of Foresight. I will explain in detail as we go throughout this sharing session. So if you're looking for the IATN link, they should be in the Zoom chat as well as the chat box of the YouTube channel. Make sure that you have timed in so that there would be CPD points that we've offered. So brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, end of last year, I was very fortunate to be given the opportunity to join a workshop by the National Higher Education Research Institute. They organized the scenario planning for higher education, and the trainer was Mr. Alex Fernani, and he is basically a PhD candidate at NUS Singapore Business School, and all of the contents of what I'm going to share is based on his sharing, and this is what we're going to do next. It was a 2-day workshop where we went through all the theories as well as going through all the application, but I'm going to just roughly share about 1 hour and a half, perhaps even less. And I believe that many of the people who joined here, they are also academicians and even staff, and you're perhaps more experienced in this matter. Feel free to share your knowledge with all of us here. So the questions that we're going to address in this session, there are 4 of them. So first of all, what is foresight? Because scenario planning is part and parcel or one of the method in foresight, and foresight is a component in future studies. And then why does foresight matter? As well as what are the phases or components in scenario planning, and how can we apply scenario planning in higher education? It's not only for the upper level of the management, but also at individual level, it's also very, very useful. I remember when we talked with the Futures Studies unit at Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge, sometimes they would engage with young people who can employ the knowledge in futures literacy to plan their own lives. So this is not only for the decision makers in higher education, but also at individual level, we can use the knowledge to improve our lives, the lives of our families, and the lives of our community. So first of all, what is foresight? And some people would use futures or future studies and foresight interchangeably, but there are a slight difference between these terms that I'm using. And before we go any further, trust me that it's very basic and accessible to all. So what is something that's constant? In the past 2 years and a half, I believe, we have seen how COVID-19 pandemic it has been unprecedented. It came by and challenged every sector, including higher education. And it's not only a matter of how can we adjust and adapt, but how can we transform the system as a whole to adapt and to move forward in a robust manner with this challenge that we are facing. I remember we started with this COVID-19, it started with 2 weeks, and we thought that it's going to just be a 2-week lockdown. It extended to become 2 months of a lockdown, and then now 2 years and many more, we are living with COVID. And when we talk about change, it's not only something that's as huge as COVID-19, but changes happen in many forms. Changes could be in terms of the leadership, or just by the fact and by the virtue that every single day technology is being advanced and changed in exponential ways, that the next day, for example, suddenly just some brands that used to be very popular just become obsolete because their other parties or their other rivals come up with better products. So change is constant, as well as it's something that innate, as we know, as we, the believers, believe that Allah says, Allah will not change the condition of people until they change what is in themselves. And change is not only happening external to us, but change is very, very much possible within us. And to adapt to changes external and internal to us, that's something that we have to constantly do. I remember just reading recently an article on the importance of not only being productive. It's not enough to just be busy and doing something every day, but we have to be busy with a direction. So scenario planning and having futures literacy will give us a sense of direction of not only just having our times filled with activities, but knowing that we are having a purposeful direction amid all the realities of this world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, as well as ambiguous. So before we go to future scenario planning, we go to the umbrella of it. This is from my understanding that there is futures literacy. Why do we call it futures? Because there are many possible futures, not only one future, but many futures. So we can come up with many scenarios. And then literacy, why is it called literacy? It is treated just as basic and as important as the ability to read and write. So when we advocate for the access to education, meaning students can read and write, futures literacy is also part of it because it gives a sense of self and esteem and moving forward with any kinds of activities that we're doing, not only management, but also for students to maneuver through their life. So it is an essential skill because anyone who can imagine, anyone who can think differently beyond the current reality, meaning we have imagination. And when we have imagination, meaning anyone can access this knowledge and acquire the skills of futures literacy. UNESCO defines the skill as that which empowers the imagination, enhances our ability to prepare, recover, and invent as changes occur. And if you can see the overlapping that I've created here, futures literacy, it is a competence that universal and accessible, as well as it opens us to the diverse possible futures. So futures studies is a field of studies of alternative futures done by university academic researchers. So it's not only about, let's use our imagination to think about the future. That's great, but at the same time, it is a whole sophisticated field of study where the academicians and intellectuals come up with many theories, as well as they deal and engage with community to apply it in reality. So while future studies or future studies is often being done, or it relates to the researchers, Foresight, on the other hand, it also employs the same methods and techniques to investigate the futures. However, the difference here is that it is being used as a management tool. So as a management tool being used by corporations, organizations, etc. And what's similar between these two is that it is used to predict the medium long-term future. So it's 5 to 10 to 50 years and beyond. And it's very, very much relevant to giant organizations and small organizations as well. So why does foresight matter? Foresight, as much as it might sound, it's a word that we don't use daily, but it's very much relevant to our daily lives. And it's a quite simple matter. Sight meaning to see something that's beyond, to see, and then for means to see something that's beyond. So foresight, to see the future. Why does it matter? Because especially with this situation that we're living in the past years, that we see how COVID changes, and as much as we thought we were used to it, SOPs change, and so many different parts of the relief change. And there are also some scholars who predict there would be other pandemics or other things that are going to change, as we see in terms of climate change, societies, activities, etc. So foresight as a management tool which uses the methods and techniques in future studies to investigate the future, we come up with potential scenarios. And potential scenarios can be imagined as many as possible to prepare for the best and worst, and all that is in between these two extremes to improve decision making in the present. It is of being surprised by probabilities in simulation rather than in reality before it is too late, and going beyond our existing biases and complacency in planning for the future. So it's not only that we sit and try to outline possible scenarios. It is also very important that the scenarios are as fair as possible, not only what we think might happen, but we go beyond our biases. We do not want to come up with 5 scenarios and then be surprised by the 6th possible scenario. So that is why in this foresight, we will see later as we go, that it's very important to involve as many stakeholders as possible and to be as representative as possible, because we want to go beyond our biases and as well as beyond our own interests, let's say as a policymaker or as a bystander and all of that. And why in decision making? So decision making usually happens daily. At the same time, decision making also happens long term in terms of the policies that we want to make and impact other people. It's not only about the reputations of the institutions who will make it, but also in terms of the interests of people who will be impacted by the decisions. So we will have all these probabilities, and it's always better to have it in simulation rather than in reality when it happened. So for example, I remember when COVID came, people would reshare this one YouTube video by Bill Gates many, many years ago when he quote unquote predicted that there would be a virus pandemic that is related to SARS. And talking about our existing biases and complacency, it's very convenient to be comfortable with where we are, especially when right now, for example, I'm sitting here, it's very comfortable. So we don't think that the future might happen differently. But millions of years ago, even dinosaurs might not even think that they would extinct. And even products that are so famous, for example, like Nokia, Kodak, and all that, they have been at the forefront of the industry. And just like that, they've been replaced by new technologies and all other changes. So the importance of futures literacy, or intangibly, or we can also say foresight, is that there's so many, as in the link that I've shared in this slide. But I'm just going to share these 4 because we can discuss a lot about these 4 importance or aspects, how futures literacy can play a huge role. So first of all is in terms of leadership. It improves leadership because leaders and leadership in general they can have enhancement in terms of the initiative and experimentation through the community. All right, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, Idayu.
Great. I'll just go back a little. That happens sometimes. So. All right, we are back, and I'm back. I had a bit of situation, and that's one example of disruption and changes that I did not expect. And thankfully, the team is here to help out. So let's continue. That is one thing that happened. Okay, so just now we were here speaking about the importance of futures literacy. So in leadership, it's not only about the leaders and their reputations, but it's also about the interests of the community that we're going to serve. And to serve the communities best, we have to know their experiences as well as their grassroots reality and what they actually go through and would desire for their well-being. In talking about sustainability, for example, we might in theory know what sustainability and well-being and happiness sounds like, but we also have to know in reality, do the theories work? So when we want to come up with initiative and experimentation, the process of using futures literacy would improve the whole sense of leadership and the outcomes of the leadership. And secondly, in terms of resilience, when we want to be resilient in the decision-making, we would want to address all the risks and uncertainties that are existing. And when we involve as many representation and stakeholders as possible in the process, as well as addressing and being objective in identifying the possible scenarios, this diversification can improve the sense of resilience of the organization and the decision-making as a whole. The third one is in terms of discovery. So futures literacy and foresight, we can detect better novelty, shocks, and surprises and make sense of why would that happen. Because many, many years ago, we would not imagine that human beings could, or humankind could fly in the sky. But I remember reading about one of the Islamic scholars having the quote unquote scenarios of what if one day human beings would be in the air and they have to pray. And they would have, so they think about these things. And now we see that how it actually happens, that people do get on airplanes and flights, and we do have to pray in the airplane and flights. So this discovery would be in advance or prior to the actual situations, and it would give us a sense of preparedness. Fourthly, in terms of choice. So we want to know what choices we have. And the more choice menus that are diverse would give us the ability to prepare. And this would not be possible unless we have the scenarios first in the first place. So if you want to know more about how futures literacy can improve our individual and organizational decision-making, definitely you can check out at the website of UNESCO. So what are the phases in scenario planning? So there are 4 here that I'm going to share in terms of framing, scanning, featuring, as well as visioning. So the first step in framing, there is a domain that we would have to describe. And the domain can be described by, first of all, the focal issue. What is the main issue that we want to address? I would give examples later in terms of how we can apply in higher education. And secondly, in terms of time horizon, we talked previously about how foresight is for medium, long-term period, but it's very important to be specific so that we can think ahead and think better in terms of the scenarios that would be possible in that period of time, because 5 years would be different with 10 years. And in terms of geographical boundaries, it's very important in all these 3 aspects to be clear, specific, and direct. And the second step in the framing phase, identify the stakeholders. So I see this, when I saw this, I was very excited because we as stakeholders, we have different levels of power as well as interest in the decision-making. So let's go with the high power, high interest quadrant. They are called the players. And the players are those with immediate power and interest, the current decision makers. And these are usually those with actual legitimate power to decide. For example, at the university, in the case of IIUM, it's the rector, the deputy rectors, the directors of the center. And then secondly, we have the context setters who have high power and probably low interest, those with power but no immediate interest, the dominant decision shapers. So in this case, it might apply to the administrative staff who would take in the instructions that we receive from the quote unquote above and execute it. The decisions have been made, we only do the execution part. And then the high interest, low power part here, it's those with immediate interest but lacking power. So people who might have high interest in a particular area, but they're not necessarily in formal power to decide anything about it. So they would have their sense of contentment or frustration affected. And usually, as we see, that people would react to this. If they're frustrated, they would go for protest and demonstration because they have interest in a particular issue, but not necessarily the power to change it, for example, at the parliament or etc. And those in the quadrant of low interest and low power, they are called the bystanders, but this might change in the future. So as we can see here that when we talk about stakeholders, it's not only, for example, the industries who invest in a particular sector, but it's also everyone that's affected in that ecosystem who have different levels of powers and interests. So the second phase is called scanning. And the first step of this part is identifying the driving forces. So all sectors have driving forces, and we address them by the dimensions. So what dimensions that can bring about change to that particular focal issue. And they're not just topics or just subjects or one-off events. So they're basically something that's of the bigger picture. So here are the acronyms. We can look at it from the political point of view, economic point of view, social point of view, technological, environmental, and legal. And we can try to identify what are the more potent dimensions of all these 6 aspects. It's not an exhaustive list. Definitely, there are also other aspects, but these are good 6 dimensions to start with. And they can be described with in terms of a spectrum. So, for example, levels. So let's take the technological part. So when we talk about this dimension, we can see the level of technological advancement or the levels of the strictness of the law. So that's one of the examples. And the second step in scanning, it is to identify the discontinuities and wildcards. And I should also add here that what we do here is not only trying to pick up any forces simply that pop up in our head. It's also important and it's very helpful to try to scan the trends and patterns in a particular sector. So a bit of research would help, and interviewing the stakeholders would give us better understanding of what are the possible driving forces. And these driving forces are also precursors to the emerging issues of the future. So discontinuities and wildcards are events that can bring about change to the focal issue, let's say politically, in terms of the change of the regime, of the governing regime. That's one of the examples. And then secondly, it's not only important to identify the events, but these events can be classified into different levels of impacts and probabilities. Let's say, for example, in Malaysia, we talk about the probability of the event of a change of government outside the general election. So what is the level of that event? What is the level of its impact to the stakeholders? That's one of the questions. And then second, what is the probability of that happening? So would we say there's a high probability of that happening again or a low probability? And these probabilities can be quantified using numbers. For example, 1 very low probability and 5 very high probability. So you can imagine that we have this numbering or quantifying that we can do in terms of the levels of impacts and probabilities. So these are factors that change the stake of the game. And the third step in scanning is to rank the driving force. So I will just show a bit of example of how we can rank this. So imagine it this way. we would have a room. Let's say I'm currently in a room and we have a whole table. So at this table, we will invite stakeholders that we have identified previously. So we have stakeholders of all representative groups, stakeholders among the players, context setters, subjects, as well as bystanders. When we have these stakeholders and we discuss about when we want to improve our interests at best, the more we would care to involve these different stakeholders. So we have these stakeholders, and then we would sit down and identify the driving forces together, work together. Let's say there are 10 people or 10 representatives in that meeting. So we have those stakeholders. We have just now identified also the particular events, not only the driving forces, but then the particular events. And then we can rank the driving forces to try to narrow down, because as much as we might have identified 100 scenarios, but we want to find the most critical ones that our organization can pay attention to. So to rank these driving forces, it's very important that not just 1 to 3 people that try to pinpoint which forces they're most interested in. It has to be fair and representative among, and fairly representative among all the stakeholders. So what we're trying to look for is the level of impact and certainty of a particular event. So from the driving forces of political all the way to legal, we would put it on a scale of being very impactful, meaning it has high impact that are going to just turn how much it's going to change things around, and then the level of certainty, whether it's very certain or just roughly certain or very uncertain. And then every single individual, what we did during the workshop last time was that every person in the group would rank it from 1 to 5, from 1, let's say, being not very impactful and not very certain, to 5 being very impactful and very certain. And these ranks by these individuals will be totaled up to represent the rank by that group. So it's a collective way of ranking the driving forces. And the third one is to choose the critical uncertainties. Perhaps we want to start with 2 or 3 critical uncertainties, and these uncertainties can be overlapped to create scenarios further. So this is an example of ranking the driving forces. Let's say in a group we have 4 members. So 1 from the players quadrant, another from the context setter quadrant, and then the rest from the bystanders and subject quadrant respectively. So when we have these members, and then we have on the top level, you see we have these members, and then we have listed and identified the driving forces. Everyone would rank the impact and uncertainty. And then we total up the scores for the impact and uncertainty, and then we can see the highest one. So let's say we see here DF6 and DF3 scores the highest. So let's say we have a limitation of time, we can focus on these 2 most potent as perceived by the team to be the most critical uncertainties to be paid attention to. And the third phase is featuring. So after we have done that, and we have known our own stakeholders who would be impacted by our decisions and bring them to the table to identify the driving forces and rank the driving forces together to the focal issue, and then we activate the stakeholders. What does it mean by that is that before this, it was very, in the previous graph that I showed, it's a very normal, calm time. But when change happens, these are the things that might happen that would activate the stakeholders and change the way they play their roles. So for example, the players, i.e. the decision makers, they might initiate change that is not supported by the group outside. So there would be conflict. And then the subjects who have a very high interest but low power, they would like to perhaps seek to form a political alliance with context setters. And then the context setters might decide to take action when previously they were very dormant. but now they want to take active action because they were part of the system before, but they didn't quite give much interest, but now they changed their mind and want to give much interest as they are very close to the players. The context setters are close to the players. And then last but not least, the bystanders. Usually the bystanders would just quote unquote hang around and wouldn't care less, but they might change their status and try to act in response to the change. For example, the bystanders might not be affected by the policies, but the bystanders see the subjects being affected by the policies in a good or in a bad way, and they might give their support to the subjects. I will give specific examples after this so that we can look at it better. And then we incorporate the discontinuities and wildcards. So the scenarios could take in the identified events where it is fitting. Previously, we identified the driving forces. So let's say we take two driving forces, and then from these two driving forces, we can create a scenario. So for example, a scenario where there is no change. For example, around the university, there is no change of the approach to teaching and learning. That's one driving force. And then second, perhaps there is no change inside the university, but there's a lot of change outside the university. So overlapping this, we have one scenario. And then we can list out further what are the events that could happen. And then we can build the scenario narrative. So in that theme, what we did and what we can do in the future is to think about how these different driving forces would behave in each scenario. So for example, we have a scenario, and politically, environmentally, legally, etc., how would the scenario change or be affected? And then as we incorporate the possible changes or the possible disruptors, it's very, very important to be consistent in the narratives of how the stakeholders would be affected. I'm just talking theoretically, later we'll see how it's going to be applied. And then we ensure that there is relevance to the focal issue, that it is actually truly going to be impacted. And the scenario can be named for easy reference, and the narratives can be written. So in future studies, futures literacy and foresight and scenario planning, narratives is the game where writing a story about a particular event is one of the key elements. It's a scientific study. At the same time, storytelling is at the heart of it. So the last phase, it's not, perhaps some other scholars would have said that there are other phases, but this is what I've learned at the workshop. First is that in creating the vision after all this scenario planning, in creating the scenario planning, it's not only knowing what to do next, but the driving goal or what is going to drive the organization forward is having a vision. And the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, what role do we want our organization to play? So in a particular scenario, how are we going to behave? Are we going to be the players or context setters, bystanders, etc.? And then second, in terms of mixing the features to fit in the scenarios. So we might have other features that can be mixed and matched, and we'll come to the details later, as well as what are macro conditions that can hold up such a future. So what are the things that have to be or have to happen at macro level for the preferred vision or that collective vision of the team to happen? And then after identifying that macro conditions, and then we'll talk about the actions or the things that can be done at administrative levels, for example, to lead to that vision. So before we go further into trying to venture and try to understand how scenario planning can be applied in higher education, let's talk about the difference between simply just having strategic planning and actually using foresight and using scenario planning in our organizational plans and vision. So in planning without foresight or planning without scenario planning, what would happen is that usually we would just use use one single future that is predetermined and predictable. Let's say we say, oh, next year or the next 5 years, COVID would be around and there would be no other changes. So that's quite predetermined and predictable. And then planning without scenario planning, it means that we only think about 1 and 5 years ahead without any further from that. And usually it only involves the upper management. So it's going to be a lot top down or top bottom. And it's a lot top down. And in terms of the way it is, the specific plans being come up with, the variation is usually just using decision trees, for example. So when we use foresight in our organizational planning, that is using scenario planning, we open up ourselves to possibilities as well as shaping as much choices as possible, and it makes all the stakeholders involved to be active instead of just passive receiver of the decision. And the scenarios are complex. As we see just now, there is a level of identifying the driving forces, and then we identify the events that can disrupt the sector, for example, and it's usually aims at long-term futures for 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And the approach is rather participatory, that we expect the stakeholders to be active instead of just passive receivers. So we take responsibilities in that. I remember when I was a student, the Student Representative Council was invited to also join in that workshop to envision IIUM 2040. And it gives the students a sense of empowerment and responsibility because they are, after all, also the impacted group. And it takes into account the interests of not only stakeholders who might put money in that sector, but it gives it considers the interests of a variety of stakeholders, even those who might not be impacted like the community outside. And it involves then roadmaps, backcasting, for example. How can we arrive to a grand vision created by all the stakeholders and then go back to today? Let's say we aim for how IIUM would look like in 2040. After creating that grand vision, we go back to today. Let's say today is March 4, 2022. What are the things that should be done today to arrive to that grand vision? So that's roughly the difference between simply just planning, and planning with scenario in the picture. All right. So during that workshop, it was a 2-day workshop that I joined, and we took quite many hours to do the hands-on activities. So since we don't have forever today, I'm just going to go through it in a very simplistic manner, in a very simple manner, because we just want to roughly see how it's going to be applied. And it can apply at the center level as well as the university level. And I might give some references from the IIUM 2040 workshop, because that is a really great example of applying foresight in determining the future of our institution. And you can easily access the book on IIUM 2040 workshop to see the outcomes, which are about no change scenario, marginal change scenario, radical change scenario, and the preferred scenario. Okay, let's try. And I would also welcome perhaps help from everyone who want to share with us your thoughts. So in the context of the higher education ecosystem, let's try to just play around with our imagination and try to apply what I have said before and shared before. And it's a very playful thing to just imagine if this happened, but at the same time, it's also serious and it could happen in the future. Or to make it more to make it easier to be understood, maybe I can use references from pre-COVID time to currently we are in 2022 and we still have COVID. So let's say, if you can recall a bit in perhaps 2019, how life was compared to today, and I'm going to just apply a bit of that. So let's frame our scenario. So now let's imagine, before I go to the framing part, that maybe I am chairing the meeting and there are also other stakeholders here. So we are doing this together. It's not just me, perhaps there are 10 of us. So we have to first, to frame, in the framing phase, we have to identify the focal issue. So the focal issue would be, let's say, the approach to teaching and learning. So now we know that in 2019, we have classrooms. It's just that usual classroom, students would come and go. And however, putting the approach to teaching and learning as the focal issue, let's see how that's going to be changed by the driving forces. And then we set the time horizon. So let's say, since IIUM is moving towards IIUM 2040 vision, let's put 2040 as the time horizon from today until 2040. So that's going to be 18 years, from more than 10 years. So that's the long term. And then we have the geographical boundaries. It can be just in the case of IIUM, but that's quite small. We can enlarge it to the national level, perhaps in Malaysia, because we have a public education system in Malaysia. So it's usually going to apply to everyone. And then we have the stakeholders. So we have stakeholders in terms of players. So here the players would be the current decision makers. It can be the Ministry of Higher Education, rectors, vice chancellors, deputy directors, deputy vice chancellors, who really have the power to impact the sector. They have high level of interest and high level of power. And then we have subjects. Subjects have high level of interest in the decisions, but they do not have power to make it. So this usually, I would say, not only but what we would refer to is it would be the students. They have high level of interest in how their education would be impacted, but they don't sit in the decision-making bodies to make the decisions for themselves. And then we have the context setters. This would be the administrative staff who execute the decisions by the high ups. And then we have, on the bystanders part, as the bystanders would imply, that people who just stand around and they have low interest and low power in the decision-making of the higher education ecosystem. So this could be the community who are living outside the university, or just anyone not impacted by the decision-making. So their life would feel just like it just goes on, whatever happens in the boardrooms. So now we did a little bit of the framing. So we talk about perhaps digital education in 2040 in Malaysia. So focal issue, time horizon, and geographical boundaries. And then we identify the stakeholders. Roughly, we understand who they are. And when we go to scanning, we talk about the driving forces. Let's talk about technologically. So the technological factor in the digitalization of education, there's so many factors to be considered there in terms of access to the devices, our strength of connectivity. And then if you want to bring that to another level, you can talk about the security of the internet, or the security of the cyber in our country. So that's part of we talk about, generally, we have the technological part, and then there are discontinuities. So what are events that can disrupt the technology in our country? So this would be the events, or what we would call as discontinuities. So it's not only talking about, devices and internet connection, but we can make it more diverse and more specific. For example, when we talk about the digitalization of education, we can talk about what if or what would be the relevance of classroom after that if we make education online 100%. So this is, I'm describing the scenario. If we make education online 100%, would we still need this physical building of the university? And then on the other hand, if we bring education online and make it digital 100%, who would have access to all our data? How can we make sure that there is no breach of data, as well as make sure that cyber is a very safe space? Because we know that now on social media, there's a lot of cyberbullying or hacking. And how can we ensure that the data of our university, for example, our research, would not be compromised? So these are specific events, or what we will call wildcards. So after we have listed this, we'll sit in our group and we'll rank the driving forces and try to find what are the events in this scenario of digitalization of education that would affect the university or our organization the most. And then we have the critical driving forces. And then we will talk about, when we go to featuring, and then now we'll see how are these driving forces and how did just now the scanning part are going to affect our future. So when we talk about, just now I was saying about, let's imagine in 2040, all education in Malaysia is digital. I know we have reservation, just let's say, okay, because I also don't agree that's the best way, but just let's say that that might happen, that might be the case. Because last time we had lockdowns when everyone had to stay at home, and education had to go online 100%, 99% of the case. So what would happen to the stakeholders when this happens? So just I was talking about, so would it still be relevant for us to have a physical building like the university, since people are not using the classroom? If students are just going to study from home, we have so many classrooms, so what's going to happen in the classrooms? So when we activate the stakeholders, for example, how would the players, subjects, context setters, and bystanders change? So players in this case are the decision makers, let's say the rector, or the context setters are the administrative staff. Perhaps we can use the classrooms for the administrative staff to have the individual rooms, or they have larger offices. Or on the other hand, the large spaces in university could be used as a space to store all the technology, ICT things. I'm not familiar with the terms, but it's used to we have our own powerhouse to adapt with the needs of that whole online and digital necessities. And then we build the scenario narratives. So to build a scenario, or let's try to create a narrative around that. So imagine, we have to tell the story just in our own words. So for example, imagine in 2040, education has to go online, meaning people just listen to lectures from their own devices. So in that case, internet has to be prevalent all over the country. And yet the question is, how can we make education more in touch and not just losing the soul? Because we see previously during online learning, students feel that it's a huge struggle to face the screen all the time. People lost their sense of community because we don't get to go into the classroom and see people physically. So how is education going to change that way? So these are narratives, and it's more on just storytelling and imagining. So one key component, or one key way to build a scenario narrative, is try to explain how would a day in a life would look like. So when digital learning or education become fully digitalized, how is it going to look like for a rector, an administrative staff, a student, and perhaps a community member outside the university? How are they going to be impacted? So we tell those stories, and those are the narratives. And in terms of visioning, when we have created such a scenario and identify the possible scenarios, and then there is where the decision making comes in, that we ask ourselves, let's say if I'm a rector or I'm a student or I'm a community member, what kind of role I'm going to play, and what are other features that we would like to bring into the picture to make the scenario better or worse. And then we can further identify the macro conditions. So in this case, for example, just now we were just talking about changing the approach to teaching and learning when we make people go to schools online only and physical building of schools become irrelevant. Other conditions that might affect us would be in terms of the internet access and the amount of time people spend on their screens. So how would that affect that digitalization as well as other impacts, for example, our health and our well-being? And then what are the actions that should be taken? So for example, in this case, if we check out the Malaysia education blueprint, we see that it has been there all along, that they want to ensure that every student in the country would have an access to the internet as well as their own device individually. It has been there. I believe that it was aimed to be by 2025. And the idea behind it of equipping every student with digital devices and digital access is out of the idea that we are heading towards the direction of IR4, Industrial Revolution 4. But now that's not the case. The case is that now we are dealing with an endemic where learning or working from home becomes an option. So that changed the way we view digital activities. And then at the same time, for example, IIUM as an institution that aims for sustainability as well as well-being, how can we equip ourselves not only with the digital access, but also to ensure the overall well-being of human beings? Because it's going to change a lot when people sit so many hours a day in front of the screen, as well as how can we also still ensure that the relationships between family members and communities are not affected when people deal with the screens a lot. So as I speak about this, we are already experiencing it, but I'm just giving an example that's very close to us. And that would be sharing that I have. So just to conclude, hold on. I can click next. All right. So to conclude here, hold on. All right, so to conclude here, when we talk about scenario planning is part of Foresight, and Foresight is also part of future studies. The difference between future studies and Foresight is that Foresight is specifically a management tool, and scenario planning gives us the opportunity to address our biases and sense of complacency in our decision making. And it involves as many and as various stakeholders as possible. So these are the four different parts of it that we can address. And there are definitely many other ways that we can further improve that situation. So some recommended readings that I can recommend is definitely we can view IIUM 2040 book that's based on a workshop. And from that book, it's a wonderful book to look at how no change scenario, marginal change scenario, radical change scenario, as well as preferred scenario, and how it's going to impact our university. And if there are any questions or any comments, we would like to also welcome anyone from who are joining us at the Zoom meeting. I believe that's all from me. Thank you very much. I hope that it benefits. So the next perhaps 15 to 30 minutes, we can further discuss this if there are any comments from the floor. And in the meantime, you can raise your hand if there are any comments. In the meantime, make sure that you have time in at the iium.edu. All the links can be found in the chat box.
Assalamualaikum, sister. So, my name is Sister Rina from Kuantan campus. Can you hear me?
Oh.
If there is any question or any comments, feel free to share with us. We would like to welcome any feedback as well.
Okay, Assalamualaikum, sister. Can you hear me?
Okay. Sorry, can you repeat the question? Just now it was muted here. Thank you.
Coba kena dengar tok tu kan.
Okay. Dr. Rina.
Okay, I'm Sister Rina, actually. Okay. Thank you for sharing this talk to us. Actually, I just want to share my experience as a counselor, psychology officer. So about 2 years or 3 years, we use online sessions most of the time because of pandemic. And actually, if we conduct face-to-face, high risk to counselor and client also. And we also, our students also stay at, not stay in the campus. Some of them stay. So this is the challenge, I think, for me and for other counselor and for also administrative. And what I learned from this COVID-19 pandemic, and we learn to work through online and digital. And what I learned from myself, I think we try our best to do like a more customer oriented, more client oriented, to make sure that students come back to us. So even we are in the online system, in digital system, but we cannot lose our human touch approach for students and for staff also. Okay, and then I think this is very important for human resource to invest more on training for staff, and do more encourage, or needs to look into job satisfactions during pandemic. I think that's all my opinions. First, we cannot lose human touch even we work for online. or digitalized friendly. And the second, the human resource is very important to make sure that the satisfaction, okay, among staff, okay. And then I think that's all from me.
Yes, thank you very much, Sister Irina, for sharing that. We really appreciate it because you bring a very important point that in terms of scenario planning and especially planning for our organization, for example, for the next 5, 30, 50 years, it is all the more reason and all the more importance to be clear and go back to our values and our philosophy and our mission and visions, because there can be many scenarios. So when there's so many probabilities or things that could happen, what would keep us grounded? And it's our values and vision. So in this case, for example, Sister Irina mentioned about human touch and that sense of humanity. And this would be the foundation for any kinds of this scenario planning as well as decision making that we're going to do. So that's a very great addition to our discussion today. If there is anyone who would like to ask any questions or like also give comments and sharing, feel free to just unmute and speak up, because we are very happy to hear feedbacks as well. Brother Azwar, are you speaking? Doctor, sorry, I'm not sure. All right, if there is no any other comments or questions and feedback, I would like to say thank you very much for joining us here at Sejahtera Center from wherever you are. Feel free to view our website of Sejahtera Center, as well as we have the website for the UNESCO Chair in Future Studies to follow the activities of the UNESCO Chair. We hope that this session has been very beneficial for you, and we look forward for future engagement in the futures literacy area. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope that you benefit a lot from it. Please stay safe wherever you are.